Good morning, or good afternoon, and welcome to the John Pender Living History of Anesthesiology series. This program of the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology in Park Ridge, Illinois, celebrates the lives of those who have made outstanding achievements in the development of the medical specialty and practice of anesthesiology. I am your host, Douglas Bacon. I am the professor and chair of anesthesiology at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. And today is October 14th, 2012. We are in Washington, D.C. to honor Dr. Mark Joseph Lema, who is professor and chair of anesthesiology at the State University of New York at Buffalo and the chairman of anesthesiology at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute. Welcome, Mark, and thank you for agreeing to chat with us about your career.
Thank you, Doug, for the invitation.
Mark, what do you have been in anesthesiology for a long time. You've worked, you and I have worked together for longer than either one of us will admit to readily. What do you think has been your greatest achievement in that time?
To be honest with you, I think the greatest achievement that anyone in academia can aspire to is to replace himself or herself with people who are going to carry the message on to the next generation. So I see the people that I've worked with, worked beside me, who have used me perhaps as a guidepost, and the residents and their successes as actually being my greatest achievement, or at least usefulness to the specialty.
Let's talk a little bit about the residency at Buffalo, because I know that you kind of inherited a mess at the time that you became the interim chair and then the full-time chair. There was a movement to actually eliminate the anesthesiology residency at the University of Buffalo.
That's true. Mess is probably a good word. I saw it as endless opportunities. And,
I see. It's sort of like the Chinese.
Exactly. And I do recall going into the then Vice President for Health Affairs, and I used an analogy which I always like to use, and I said, we are offering you what is equivalent to a 1962 Ford Fairlane without air conditioning and a radio. And if you start to negotiate down from that, it's going to be the tires and the steering wheel, and the car won't run. So it's pretty much a take it or leave it operation. And he respected that. And I also pointed out to him that the LCME doesn't require that you need an anesthesiology department in order to be a successful medical school. And he reflected on that, and he looked me straight in the face and said, you know, you're absolutely right. He said, however, he said, to my knowledge, I've never seen a successful surgical program without a successful anesthesiology program. He said, so you're safe. And it's been good ever since, and I'm 13 years now in that job, and I think we haven't gone to the dean to ask for much unless we've needed it. We've been pretty self-sufficient, but when we have needed it, the deans recognize that it's not fluff, and they usually come through.
Is there anything in the residency of which you're particularly proud?
Yes, actually, I'm proud that without engaging in some mutual admiration, I'm certainly proud with the respect that you got your start at the University at Buffalo, and you're a proud demonstration of just how deep the commitment to education goes. We've had other professors, as you know, one of your contemporaries, Oscar De Leon, Kathy O'Leary, and it's always terrible when you start mentioning names because there's someone you're going to forget. But then we've had people like Nader, who came on board, and Jerry Lerman, who we inherited from Toronto, and Fred Burrows. These were all professors over the years, and forgive me for those of you who I should be recognizing and I'm not. But I think we've had a very strong program. But I think I would have to at least talk about two people very quickly. One is Paul Knight, and the other one is Jerry Barlow.
I was about to ask you about Paul Knight, because that's a very interesting situation. Paul having chose not to seek reappointment as chair, but staying in Buffalo, and the community blaming a lot of the problems within the residency on Paul, whether fairly or unfairly, and you needed, but clearly Paul, with his NIH funding, was an integral part to the residency, especially in terms of the research requirements that the RRC has. And that must have been a very interesting time for you.
Well, I admired what Paul was able to do. I mean, Paul was a true researcher, and you know, obviously we have the same degrees, and he exercised the Ph.D. to a greater extent than I was capable of doing during my career because of other interests. And so I very much respected that. I think my strengths at the time were in people management, and his were in research. And we had the opportunity to juxtapose our positions, and he became the vice president the vice chair for research, and he's been very happy in that position, and a number of times has told me that this was the job he was most suited for. And I have basically been his, for those of you who know Buffalo football, Reggie McKenzie, running interference for him, and
the pulling guard, as it were.
Yes, making sure that that his path was unobstructed, so that he could get the excellence. And we now have a T32 grant with two
T32 grant is a training grant.
A training grant that's an NIH grant that they're very difficult to get, and
there's only about a dozen of them in the country.
Not that many, you're absolutely correct, and so we're very proud of that. We're one of only a handful, maybe less than 5 programs where Dr. Knight is the MSTP chair, so our anesthesiology department has flourished.
The MSTP program that's the
MD Ph.D. program. So, you know, without to sing the praises of Paul, I think that those are the accomplishments that a good chair also relishes, because he or she creates the environment so that people are able to flourish, the servant leader concept.
And one of the other things that you've kind of left out in all that was you also created the environment for him to become a distinguished SUNY professor.
Yes,
which is, I believe, the first anesthesiologist ever so to do.
Yes, he is going to have that distinction, and we're very proud of that. And both Paul and I now have received the SUNY Chancellor's Awards, for his for research and mine for faculty service, which I think highlights again. We're sort of like the quiet company, and so we put
Buffalo's
together.
Not well known that way, but it is a place of great excellence.
Probably because it's a virtual program as opposed to a real program. There's no university hospital. My position is, albeit almost a part-time position for the university, because of my role at Roswell Park. They're separate, as you know, separate locations. So being a chair can't be part-time. So basically it's like having 2 jobs, as you know. And I think it takes a little bit more effort to try and make that work. But you know, we've been very successful over the years, largely due to the volunteerism of the faculty.
The other gentleman you mentioned was Jerry Barlow.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about his role.
Well, Jerry Barlow was, and still is, without a doubt, one of the greatest statesmen in anesthesia. Many people know Jerry as being the director for 9 years and brokering a lot of deals in the board of directors. Jerry was a very good fiscal manager of the department, and when he recognized that my opportunities were starting to develop to the point where I was a real contender to be a department chair, he voluntarily stepped aside to allow me to take that position. And I don't think you know, most people would generally do something that magnanimous. So I owe him a great deal of thanks and respect over the years. And he was a great advisor, serving as the you know, senior vice chair for almost as many years until that I've been chair until he retired. So it's been great working relationships with Paul and Jerry and of course all the other faculty but in speaking specifically about the administration, those two would come to mind.
What about the education? I mean, Buffalo is a unique, as you mentioned, unique facility in that you have 5 or 6 clinical sites at any given time, and you really, as the chair, don't have control over perhaps any of those sites with the exception of Roswell, where you have the other hat as also the chairman of the department. And so how have you managed to get everybody on the same page?
Well, large cattle prods often work, and they have to be quite long to reach the other sites. But seriously, I think trying to educate the volunteer faculty as to what the purpose of a residency training program is. They work very hard, but as most people who are in private practice know, the primary role of private practice is to get the cases done as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And a residency training program isn't necessarily the most efficient way to get things done. So they have to balance and blend, and they've done a remarkable job, largely because many of them had trained and understood just what it took to get the quality into the residents. So, I mean, it hasn't been a perfect marriage, but certainly it's been perfect enough that we have met all the benchmarks now for the American Board of Anesthesiology in terms of our pass rates, and we only had 3 citations the last time, which was not too bad in this day and age.
That's incredible, actually.
So, and 2 of them were somewhat minor. So I think we're poised to really continue to grow. We now have 12 positions. When I started, there were 6 per year, and again, we judge our American medical programs by the desirability of Americans to want to train in them. Nothing personal towards people who aren't trained in the United States, but that's how the ACGME looks at it, and we've continually tried to balance American trained physicians with high quality international medical graduates and osteopathic physicians, and the blend has worked to our advantage.
Let's go back in time just a little bit to the other recreational, or reclamation, I should say, reclamation job that you did at Roswell Park.
Well, yes.
Why did you leave? You know, you're at a Harvard affiliate. You have a Harvard appointment as a assistant professor, and you leave, Brigham and Women's to come to Roswell Park, that is, at that time, probably functioning somewhere in about the mid-50s. Yeah. And it's about 1988, if I remember correctly, because I was a resident at that time, and you were the bright young savior of our program.
Yeah, well.
And you're going to come in and do all this research and make us all glad. But I've always been curious why you would leave a setup where you had everything to go to this place that really was kind of a hole.
Well, I have to tell you,
that's being generous.
I don't disagree with you. I think part of it might have been naivete, but because I took the chair at 38 years old, 2 years out of residency, and there's a couple of stories about that. A venerable gynecologic oncologist who had just assumed the chair of gynecologic oncology after 25 years was talking with me about the position, and here I was at a 10-page CV, 2 years out of residency, and I recall him saying to me, it's taken me 25 years to get to this point. I have over 200 publications, on and on. He said, and you're just getting started. And he said, what do you have to say about your modest CV compared to that? And I thought about it, and I looked at him. I said, I think you chose the wrong specialty. And he liked that.
Is that the gentleman I think it was?
Yes, it is.
Yes, okay.
He liked that response, so obviously I got the job. I obviously went on to say that anesthesia was in its adolescence at the time, so there was plenty of opportunity for people like me to do that. There's a couple of things. Harvard has a lot of great people, as does Penn and Stanford and the like, and there's a lot of great people, but to take that experience and knowledge and go back to what happened to be my hometown at the time and to ostensibly make a change for the better, I think is part of the mission of programs that train chairs and train future chairs. And I had the opportunity to interview for, not to say that I would have got them, but I had the opportunity to interview for Harvard chairs subsequently. But I've always felt that I would do my most good by taking a program like the University of Buffalo and taking it from a very mediocre program to a respectable program. And I think we're almost there. And I think it was the right thing to do. There is another factor that I think has to be mentioned. Harvard pays you partly in money and partly in prestige. I doubled my salary when I went from Boston to Buffalo and halved my cost of living. So I'm sure there was a motivation there as well.
So to quote the other great pulling guard of the Bills of that year, Joe DeLavalere, you can't eat glory.
That's absolutely. So I think the combination of factors made me pick it. I can tell you 6 months into the program, and if my wife were here, she'd corroborate the feeling. I really felt like I made a mistake. There was an assistant director of nursing. We were sitting in a meeting, and I was just amazed at how far behind the Roswell program was back in '87, and she turned to me after some incredulous statement was made that was so antiquated, and she says, "How does it feel to be a medical anthropologist?" And that hit the nail right on the head. I said, "Oh my God!" I said that she's so correct, because I literally could not get rid of the anesthesia machines and give them to the veterinary department because they said that they didn't meet their codes. And these were the machines that we were using in the operating room. So I obviously had to use that statement to get the state-of-the-art machine.
By the time I got there, 2 years later, you were you still had the bullet EKG.
And I still have the bullet EKG.
It's still in your office?
It's still in my office.
Well, how about the machine with the nitrous flush?
Yes. The 42 Heidbrinks is there, and you never know. If the lights go out, I'm ready to go. And they even have explosion-proof plugs.
Oh, so, good. So you've upgraded the machine a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. So we can use ether.
The other thing I remember was I was reading about ureteral silk catheters, which were, as you know, first used for epidural placement in the late 1940s. And I said, geez, I wonder what one of those looked like. And you walked over to the set and said, oh, would you like one?
Yes, I inherited quite a lot of memorabilia, I suppose you'd call it now.
Including a couple of anesthesiologists.
Yes, a couple of anesthesiologists, and I have a full supply of red rubber tubes, cuffless, but I have the cuff that you slipped on. And of course, you need a clamp. There was no other way to do it. But
rubber cement too sometimes.
Yes, that's right. Yes, so we have a number of devices that should old-time anesthesia come back, we're fully prepared to.
So with the new health initiative to do everything in the house,
Obamacare, I think, will probably
you're ready. Okay,
allow us to dust some of those off, bring them back. So,
let's go back to where you were born and raised in Buffalo.
Yes.
Where'd you go to high school?
Well, I went to a Jesuit high school, not surprisingly, I suppose. But no, I went to Canisius High School in Buffalo, and then, like all good Jesuit high school boys, I was indoctrinated enough to go to Canisius College. And almost went to Georgetown, but logic prevailed, and then went to SUNY Downstate. The difference being about, back then, $12,000 a year. It was only about $3,500 back then to go to medical school versus $15,000 at Georgetown, which people thought, how much higher can it go? And I think we know that answer now.
My son is looking at the University of Colorado at $70,000 a year.
$70,000 a year. Well, I think that's a new record that I've heard for sure. So, I ended up moving my family from Buffalo to Brooklyn, which probably was a very positive experience.
But between college and med school, you did your Ph.D.
Yes, I started out as interested in medicine when I went to college, but it turned out that I became more enamored by the social life, the social scene, the politics, And one of the senior, actually was, I think he was a senior at the time, got me involved in class politics. He's now, and has been all his life, a state assemblyman. So I was his first campaign manager when he ran for student government president at Canisius College, and then finished up. I started in biochemistry, which was a new discipline at the time, and ended up in political science. So I don't think
that's why you and I got along so well, because
yes.
Political science is nothing more than a historian with a crystal ball.
That's right. Yes. And it still had science in it. So I was a distant relative to the hard sciences. I took the LSATs, did very well. I had an interview at UB Law School, and met my wife, who actually I have to credit for inspiring me to go back and try. It was around the time when people who didn't have science degrees were getting into medical school. They were looking to broaden the experiences. I don't know if that was ever that successful, but nonetheless, that was the opportunity. So I did that, and as I was doing the master's, there was a one-year master's where you could round out your education since I did no sciences. I actually really enjoyed research, so I went on to do the Ph.D., and then 3 years later, my wife again overheard me talking about, well, I thought maybe I should go to medical school, and then she came up with the final statement. She said, I want you to apply to medical school because 20 years from now, I don't want you to be saying would've, should've, could've. Do it now. Put forth your best effort. If you don't make it, then you'll know that you did your best and you didn't make it, and you can go on to other things. So that was prophetic, I guess, because obviously made it. Here I am today.
And she sacrificed quite a bit along the way during that time, because you had a couple of children in there too.
Well, and an 18-month-old, and when I announced
when you went to medical school.
Yes, when I announced we were leaving a very nice, comfortable home that we owned in the University District, right down the street from the University of Buffalo, to Flatbush,
didn't you?
Pardon me?
Allenhurst Road?
Allenhurst, yeah.
Yeah, because I grew up on Allenhurst Road.
Oh, so there you go. Look,
I was on 53. I think you were a little further down.
One something. Right?
Yeah.
So it was a very nice place to live, and then we looked in Flatbush. And I remember my wife, they back then, they would steer you. You can't do that anymore. But they would keep these special houses in their back pocket. And then when they interviewed you well enough to think that you'd be a good neighbor, they would say, oh, something just came up. And they'd take you to these special places. Totally illegal today, but back then, probably illegal back then too. But so we went to see one of these places, and the woman tried to sell my wife on it, who's bouncing my oldest son. And she said, this Flatbush area is really changing. She said, I'm really encouraged. She said, last night I put my flower pots on my porch, and this morning when I woke up, they were still there. And that's all my wife had to say. We are not moving to Flatbush, if that's an accomplishment, to keep your flower pots on you. So we ended up going to Valley Stream, and we stayed there for about 5 years. And I went to Staten Island Hospital for my internship, which was quite enjoyable. And during my medical school training, there's actually 3 people who really influenced me to go into anesthesia. I had no interest whatsoever based on my experiences early on, because I just didn't see anesthesia from the right perspective. I remember Dr. Benton King, he really tried to get people interested, God bless his soul, but he would look at like rubber tubing on the anesthesia machine, and as a medical student, we were trying to obviously learn medicine, and he'd point to it and he'd say, see that tubing up there? And and he'd say, how do you think we sterilize it? So I'd look at him, I don't know, alcohol? And he goes, ethylene oxide. You know, it's like, oh my God, get me out of here. I said, there's no way I'm going into this specialty.
That's really funny because Benton King
Yeah.
was actually one of the chairs of anesthesiology
in Buffalo. In Buffalo, I know. This is, I'm telling
this
you.
is after he left.
This is interwoven.
Yeah.
This is all interwoven. And he was at the Brooklyn VA at the time. And this was painful. He was a nice guy, but this was painful. But what sort of started getting me interested in anesthesia was the evidently the other anesthesiologists took pity, and they literally hid me in the broom closet. And Benton would come out and say, "Where's that medical student?" They said, "Oh, we sent him upstairs to see a pre-op," because they know he'd go back into his office and wouldn't come out for the rest of the day. So then they'd knock on the door and say, "He's gone," and then they'd come out and they'd let me do spinals and everything, you know, which, I mean, medical students now would drool if someone let you do spinal, but they would let me do that. So I started getting interested in it, and then the person who actually was a very close friend of mine and is still close is Dr. Ray Sinatra. Ray was a Ph.D. student who actually went into medical school in the third year. They had a program there at Downstate, and I actually wrote a letter as a medical student recommending Ray to medical school, which was only these things can happen because I was a Ph.D. at the time. So Ray comes and he wanted to be a neuroscientist, and he said, I'm thinking of going into anesthesia. And I go, oh my God, I'm thinking of the ethylene oxide issue. And you got to be kidding me. You're throwing your career away and everything. He goes, no. He said, this is great. He said, it's the first 2 years of medical school. It's pharmacology. He said, you get to leave at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You can do your research. He says, it's really great. So I said, well, maybe I'll look into it. And then they had this young, bright department chair who had just come in the first couple of years and was really heavily trying to recruit people into anesthesia. And he would have us sit in a semicircle at the end of our rotation and ask us what our interests were, and if there was any entree that he could make into suggesting that maybe you'd like to look at anesthesia, he would. And his name was Jim Cottrell. And so I remember I was like third or fourth sitting down in this little row of chairs, and people, he came to me, and I started out by saying, well, I have a Ph.D. in physiology. And he said, well, it would be absolutely stupid if you didn't consider going into anesthesia. And I go, oh boy, what does this guy know? This is like the most boring specialty. But I started, all these factors came in, and then finally the third person was Alex Gatta. And I was only going to go into anesthesia if I could do critical care. And he says, well, the two places that really have anesthesiologists, apart from going up to Boston, that really have anesthesiologists nearby would be Luke Kitahata's program at Yale and Graziano Carlone's program at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Well, it was a no-brainer. I mean, I'm now into my second kid, who was born a week before my medicine final. And so I went and did my externship at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I really fell in love with anesthesia, and then was lucky enough to get interviewed in Boston and Columbia and Cornell, and those are all stories. And even Harry Woolman at Penn. So I got to see all the big legends when I was there. So
who interviewed you at Columbia?
Heinrich Bendixen.
Ah.
Yes.
The big critical care guy.
Yes, yeah. I almost went there. I remember Joe Artuzio. I called him up, and it was a telephone interview. Joe was great. So I told him who I was, Ph.D., this, that. He said, listen, he says, I'm going to tell you, I'm accepting you right now. He said, but we do no research here. We do no research here. So if you want to come, it's all clinical. We do no research. So I said, well, I don't know. Well, I don't know about that. So probably would have been a good choice back then, but as it turned out to be a big research program now. But it was quite an interesting period, I think, from a young anesthesiologist perspective.
And so why did you go to Boston?
Well,
what led you there?
Well, the allure, you know.
I mean, I know you're not a Red Sox fan, or you weren't at least.
Yeah, well, my son became a Red Sox fan.
Yeah, you were always a Yankees fan.
Yeah, big time. So, I guess it was the allure of a Harvard program. I think, Harvard's a lot like the Yankees. You either love them or hate them, and I think the best department, bar none, at Harvard, without a doubt, is the public relations department, because they get all the best and the brightest to come there and work for 80, 90, 100 hours for like peanuts, and love it. So it was just very hard to turn down, and it was a great experience. It really was. It was a wonderful experience. I'm sure I would have had a great experience at Penn. Penn was a spectacular program, as was Cornell and Columbia. So I was really blessed. I think I had a delectable dilemma, as Heinrich Ben Dixon told me when I told him where I was going. He said, I've used that term ever since he told me that. Delectable dilemma. He says, you can't make a bad choice.
Yeah, that's quite true. So tell me a little bit, what was the training like at, you were at the Brigham?
Yes. Well, I can tell you one thing, that the prophecy that Ray Sinatra actually predicted was totally false. I started in January because I finished medical school in three and a half years, got a residency, internship I should say, in January, and then started my anesthesia training in residence. It was good and bad, because everybody, when you start in January and they're not used to a July start, you're walking in on day 2 and they think it's day 6 months and 2 days, and so you really have to let them know, no, I'm a 2T. I'm not, I really don't know which end of the laryngoscope to put in the mouth yet, but if you teach me, I'm a fast learner. So I remember the first 2 weeks we lived in Framingham. It was about 27 miles from the Brigham, which was close. It's the closest place I could afford, let's put it that way. And I was driving through this forest for 2 weeks. It was the middle of January, and I'd get up at like 5:30, or I'd be on the road at 5:30 in the morning. I'd be getting home 9:30 at night, and I'd be getting up again for 2 weeks. And then I'm doing 3 hips a day. And then, like, it was a Saturday, and I was on my first call after 2 weeks. And I realized that I wasn't going through a forest on Route 9, but these were the backs of all the houses that had fences, and there was a tree-lined street. So it took me really 2 weeks before I saw daylight. So that's how the residency started. And I went there for this young, very promising new chair, named Ben Cavino, who wasn't so young because he had done a Ph.D. and many people may not realize, but they used to call him the father of bupivacaine, because he worked for Astra Pharmaceuticals before that.
Funny you should go there, because he is a University of Buffalo grad,
exactly.
A medical school grad.
Exactly.
You just couldn't get rid of Buffalo.
I'm telling you, I couldn't. He actually came in with a PhD and was a professor, or was an assistant professor in the physiology department while he was a medical student. And it was untimely death with Ben, but it was my privilege as a young chair to invite him as a visiting professor, and to have someone of his stature come the first year that I was at Roswell, and deliver lectures not just for anesthesia but for the physiology department. Was quite a rare privilege for me. And but no, I went there for Ben. This idea back then, regional anesthesia, was becoming real popular, more so than just spinals. Very few people maybe remember that it was the mid-'80s when we introduced epidural morphine. So this was a new technique that people were employing, and we were on the cutting edge of it. And
it was in '89 we started the epidural service at Roswell, and that was actually why I came to Roswell, because nobody was doing it in the city of Buffalo at that time, and I thought, geez, I might as well go do something new. That and the fact that I had no other job.
Yeah.
But, well, I did have another job.
Yeah, another job, but you you were a real find. We were blessed to have you take that.
I was blessed to have you be my guardian angel at that time. And that's another story for another time.
Indeed, it is.
So you knew Ben, Dr. Cavino. You knew Jerry Ostheimer.
Jerry Ostheimer became close friend. He really did guide me in OB. He was a superb clinician. He was really a superb clinician, and again, an untimely death for Jerry. But and he was a very good ethicist for medicine, and really I learned OB anesthesia, and it was somewhat unique at Brigham because there was a track early on. I guess it was to attract us and keep us there, but we could be 50% OB and 50% cardiac. It's almost unheard of. Why would the two aren't even closely related? But it seemed to work there, and there were a number of people that did that, and some eventually gravitated to all cardiac, and some gravitated to all OB. But early on, it was just a wonderful opportunity, and I got in on the ground floor of the heart transplant program, and did like the second, third, fourth heart transplants in Boston, something like that. But single digits, I remember. Maybe it was third, fourth, and fifth. But that was a wonderful experience. I mean, there was just a lot of experiences. I participated in the first liver transplant at Deaconess. So I got to do a lot there, was even as a resident able to do pediatric hearts for 2 months. Was something that I think, again, most residents would drool over.
Yeah.
So it was a different era.
It was. It truly was.
And I stayed on staff, and again, Ray Sinatra and I went through almost parallel. Well, not almost did. We paralleled. He was about 6 months out of step, because he finished medical school at normal time. And so we went through the whole program together, right through to anesthesia staff. And he then, I think he was done just for a couple of months, and then he went to Yale and retired in that job. And so it turned out to be a wonderful experience. I was there for about 2.5 years, and then got this call to look at the program at Roswell Park, and that's where I did my Ph.D. I was at the State University of New York at Buffalo Physiology Department, but I did my work at Roswell Park, and so I knew the program very well, and it was I was sort of stunned when I went back, because when I left, it was one of the top 4 cancer hospitals in America, and when I went back there, it was government that had government building with green walls, and it was like the phoenix that had to rise out of the ashes. So I enjoyed that. We built a new hospital, which is a rare opportunity for someone to do that, and worked with a brilliant scientist leader, Tom Tomasi, and the rest is history. I think, Roswell has its rightful place.
The chief medical officer was the inventor of the pacemaker?
That's right, Andy Gage, who always told me to stay in academia and administration. He says, look at me, I'm 75 and I'm still getting phone calls to do things. And so you can work as long as you want. And I think it's still pretty much true.
To some extent.
You can still do that. So
it's interesting because I also benefited from your Harvard connections in that Jerry Astheimer was, just before his death, was starting to mentor me a little bit in the history, as he was interested in developing that part of his career.
Well, Jerry was a true mentor. He was, and the people in who went on to be great OB anesthesiologists to this day recognize that. And I know at SOAP they have the Gerard W. Astheimer lectureship, and I just can't stress enough how much he would reach out and make you feel like your issue was important. Never dismissing it like, geez, can you come back sometime when I'm bored? But always taking the time to actually make sure that your question was answered. He was the one, when I would thank him, I think he was one of the first people who, when I said, gee, I don't know how to thank you enough for for giving me this opportunity to speak at ASRA or, something like that. And he says, at Harvard here, he said, we don't accept the thanks. You have to pass it on to somebody else. In other words, seek to replace yourself. So in other words, the onus is on you to do it for someone else, which means you had to get to a point where you had the capability of doing it for somebody else.
Yeah.
So I think that was one. I hope they still, and I'm sure it's not just Harvard. I'm sure it's
well, actually, that's what you taught. That's what you taught all of us
Yes.
to do, and those of us that made it to that point have pretty much carried that tradition on.
That's true.
And I never realized that it came from Jerry.
Yeah, it came from Harvard. Jerry, I recall being the person who first said it to me, but it really could have been anybody, because that was the whole. Yeah.
After 12 years at Mayo, I can't admit that it's a Harvard thing.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah. So, that was an untimely death for Jerry, and a real loss. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Jerry was very close to actually taking the chair at the University of Buffalo.
Yes.
And what happened, it wasn't his death that prevented it, it was Ben's death that prevented it. And I remember, because we were making plans on how he was going to transition, and then Ben passed away the morning he was supposed to come to the ASRA meeting, probably around 1987 or so, in Cincinnati. And I remember sitting in the Marriott there with Jerry, and we were stunned. And I remember him just saying, "You realize I have to stay?" And I said, "Well, you realize that they're not going to make you permanent chair." And he says, "It doesn't matter." He says, "That's what I have to do." And he was right. And he had to, during that time of turmoil, because the Brigham wasn't that far down the road in its transition, been 5 or 6 years, maybe 7 years, and it was still a young program, and Jerry did shepherd it to at least to the point where they were able to bring in blocking his name. They were able to bring in Simon Gelman, who then took it to the next level. Really helped to expand the research, etc.
The other person you really haven't talked about is Roy Van Dam.
Well, that was a special relationship. Everyone, not a special relationship in that Roy was ever really a warm and cuddly person, but he was a caring person, and in his own way, he was a very sensitive man, and he really was later on, I was talking with him, and he would always be very kind to me, and I don't know why, because we used to go to Parker Hill. It was the Harvard Community Health Plan Hospital. It was called Parker Hill Hospital back then. And Roy was in semi-retirement, and he was doing bunions and pilonidal cysts and dental extractions.
Ouch.
And the pilonidal cysts were done at hypobaric spinals. We would position the patient and then put the needle in and aspirate CSF and then inject. All the bunions, of course, were done with ankle blocks, which were in a very ceremonious way, a la Labat. We used the Labat text. He actually Xeroxed the pages from the Labat text. And then we did blind nasal intubations for all of our dental extractions, and they all served me well. I recall blind nasal intubations on full stomachs and Route 1 with fractured jaws and all sorts of techniques that helped out over the years. But it was known to, first of all, it was known to all the residents that you weren't going to go to Parker Hill Hospital unless he wanted you to go. So not every resident went there. So the fact they said, well, you're going to Parker Hill Hospital, you knew that he at least had some interest in you. But the real test with Roy was that Friday muffin. The Friday muffin, yes. If you tried to impress Roy, you were dead in the water. Roy did not need to be impressed by residents, junior residents. But if you listened to him and learned from him, he clearly appreciated that. And all I wanted to do was learn everything I could from it. This was just an amazing opportunity. And I remember Roy would always touch you on the shoulder because he was used to grounding himself walking in so that he didn't create any sparks, even though we'd long since given up ether. But he'd always, hit you hard on the shoulder. And I remember that pat. And he says, I have a muffin for you out there. Why don't you take a break? And I knew I had made it, And he actually went on. I still have the cup. He received a cup, I think it might have been an atracurium cup. And it was a cup where you could write your name in it. And if you wrote it with magic marker, it would stay permanent so you'd never lose the cup, whatever gimmicks they came up with at the time. So he got this cup, and he actually wrote my name on it and gave it to me. He said, I thought you might like this. So I actually have a cup that Roy gave me with my name on it, written by Roy. So I thought that was very special. I don't use it much, but I still have it.
When you were at Harvard, you won a Parker B. Francis.
Yes, very interesting. This is, I remember this. Ben came, we did 2-year residencies then. They were jam-packed. I did maybe 1,800 cases in 2 years, but we did 2 years. And it was September, and I was finishing up in January. And he said, he said, there's this Parker B. Francis Award. It's $100,000, $50,000 a year for 2 years. He said, I'd like you to apply for it. And I said, well, Dr. Covino, I'd love to apply for it. I said, but I haven't finished my residency and everything. He said, we've taken care of that. He said, you're going to be doing obstetrical anesthesia with Dr. Ostheimer, and he's going to be giving you time. Just the morning you'll make rounds, do so. But in the afternoon, he says, you can go write the grant. Okay? So I go, okay. So I had a month to write the Parker B. Francis grant. But he set me up nicely with a brilliant, absolutely brilliant co-resident of mine named Fred Julian, who was probably 22 to 30 years, well, not that long, about 22 years my senior, who was a researcher who decided to go back and do his residency at about 48 or something like that. Well, Fred actually was a muscle physiologist extraordinaire. It was so extraordinary that he worked with Aldous Huxley on the Z-bands. And so this is the lab I went into. And so he said to me, he said, I'd like to study the presence of smooth muscle myosin isozymes. They hadn't been discovered at the time. And for those people who know muscle physiology, it's a lot easier to do skeletal muscle because it's about 80% myosin versus 20% myosin in smooth muscle. So the next 2 years, I ended up doing this project, and I would get 60% research time, 20% clinical time as a junior attending. And I honestly had nightmares about this after 2 years. I mean, this was probably the toughest thing I ever did. But we were successful, and I actually, in circulation research, had one of the seminal papers on the presence of smooth muscle myosin isozymes. I only got 2 papers in those 2 years. The other one was the technique for extracting bioactive smooth muscle myosin isozyme using high-performance liquid chromatography. So I really thought I had a great future, and that was probably the biggest casualty of me going to Buffalo, because you couldn't do all the things that Buffalo needed to have done to bring it back into the sphere of contemporary anesthesia at the time, and the research. So I tried doing the research, but I had to give it up.
Well, we talked a little earlier about your family, and you mentioned you had 2 children.
Yes. Well,
and I know that you have more than that.
Yes, I do. Yes. The 3rd child was born about 3 months after I got to Brigham. She proudly says she was born in Boston at the Brigham. So I have 2 sons and a daughter. My oldest son was, as I said, 18 months. And I must have done something right, because 2 out of 3 are physicians. And my middle son is a videographer, filmmaker, and probably has the other elements of my personality, you know, the exploring the new things, trying different things. So I see a lot of him a lot of me and him, a lot of me and him. And so I've been blessed with all three. And my oldest is actually finishing up. He has an MD Ph.D. and he is finishing up a retina fellowship. So he's an ophthalmologist with a retina fellowship training. And my daughter is currently the chief resident in dermatology, and she's going to be finishing up. We're going to be finishing up at the same time. And my middle son has been very successful, and he's got a very catchy studio called Lema Studios, after the monkey, and great play on words, and we're very proud of all three of them.
You know, we haven't talked about your role at ASA yet, and also, and also, you know, preceding that, your role at the New York State Society, both as editor of the Sphere and then as editor of the ASA newsletter. Probably your greatest fame with Emperor's New Clothes, and people still talking about that
today.
Tell us a little bit. Well, how did you get involved in the NYSSA? I mean, you really didn't.
Well, you know, what really started it all off was Jerry and Ben being in ASRA. ASRA was my specialty society. I had very little interest in ASA. I know that people might find that as a, you know, to me the ASA was more Midwest and Southern, and we were involved in regional anesthesia in Boston and everything. And not that there was anything wrong with the ASA, it's just that ASRA seemed to be an exciting, really exciting, new, developing all these regional techniques. And so I really was very interested in that. When I left Boston, ironically, I was surrounded by a lot of ASA presidents. Unbeknownst to me, in '84 I covered for Jeep Pierce as a junior attending, so that he could be president of the ASA, and constantly would be mumbling about something called patient safety, and then Jess Weiss gave me some advice about when you go to Buffalo. He said the first thing you do, I don't think he used the term homage, but he said the first thing you do is you pay homage to Dick Ament. And I listened to him, and I went out to lunch with Dick and said, just tell me what I have to know to succeed in town. And I think that was probably the best thing I ever did for my success in Buffalo. But just to go back to the Brigham before I talk about this, that I have to tell you, this was an absolutely unique time. It was an environment that Ben created, and I don't think people appreciate this because there were all sorts of attendings running around doing crazy things that we thought were crazy because all we wanted to do was regional anesthesia, and we wanted to do hearts. And then we'd have this guy like Phil Liu come up to us and give us a test because he wanted to do something called education in anesthesia, you know, and, you know, sure, Phil, yeah, we'll fill out a couple of things for you. And then I distinctly remember as we were in attending, Bev Phillip was away with Jim, and we were starting this ambulatory surgery, and everyone, you know, they said, well, you know, who wants to be involved in this? And we said, you know, no one would want to be involved in it. They always wanted the big cases. But you know, Bev had taken an interest in this. He said, well, why don't we talk to Bev? Because she seems to have an interest in this ambulatory anesthesia thing. You know, who wants to do this? And remarkable. I mean, both of these people were pioneers. And then, of course, in the background, there was someone running around giving us a sheet of paper asking us to gauge our intubation skills with the way the uvula was positioned, and that was Raumel and Potty. So these are all contemporaries at the time, and just brilliant in the way they could actually pick out the future of where anesthesia was going, while all we wanted to do was, you know, put Swan-Ganz catheters in people and stick needles in people, and they were developing the specialty. So it was quite an interesting time at the Brigham. But so then what happened, to get back to the ASA thing, I went to NYSSA, and Dick Ament said, well, listen, we really need you to participate in the NYSSA, and we have the PGA. And I said, hey, I went to the PGA a couple of times. It's a pretty good meeting, you know. I thought, why not get involved in that? It was certainly a better structured component society than Massachusetts Society, which wasn't a bad society, but I mean, when you compare the two, it was
Well,
in scope and breadth, it was much bigger.
And New York is much bigger.
Yes.
More anesthesiologists.
Yeah. So I got involved in it, and I remember them asking me what I wanted to do, and Erwin Lear had gone to run the ASA newsletter, and there was an opportunity to take this on, and I started with Sphere, and really enjoyed it, and then when I stepped down from Sphere, I often say I was without a chairman or an editorship for about a minute, because I went to the back of the room to take my seat after getting the plaque for service to the society, and there's this Bill Owens, this president-elect, saying, "Can I see you?" And he said, Erwin Lear held on for one more year because he knew you were stepping down. We'd like to know if you'd be the newsletter editor. And I said, well, sure. What a great honor that was. And I did that for 6 years, and it seemed to me that I wrote about things that I figured, gee, if these were problems for me, they're probably problems for everybody else, and so I would write about those, and sure enough, people seemed to relate to what I wrote. And then, of course, the trick was to try and be provocative without, overstepping the line. And once or twice we overstepped the line. I think the biggest fun, as you pointed out earlier, was writing The Emperor's New Clothes, and people still attribute to me that I said everyone should wear a tie. I think they should go back and read it. To my knowledge, I never told anybody to wear a tie. I said you should probably look like all the other physicians look, so they don't mistake you for someone who takes the garbage out or something to that effect. And but even to this day, believe it or not, just last year, I had someone come up to me and say, I got to tell you, I started dressing up, and it made a world of difference. And I said, well, all we want to do is make you aware of the fine line between success and failure, and this way you knew when you crossed it.
One of the funniest things happened at one of the resident roasts in Buffalo, when they gave you the award for having the best dressed group of attendings.
Yes, yeah.
And they made some comment about, was your hairdresser in the audience?
Yeah. Yeah, we had a lot of fun with that, and if you couldn't laugh at that, we're far too serious. But it did get people's attention, and it sort of set the tone. And it was as the crow's nest. People go to that page first to hear what you have to say, and really that was a lot of fun. I think that part of my career with ASA was some of the best years. I really did enjoy those years. I felt arguably I was probably the most visible person in the ASA because everyone saw my picture. I remember meeting the wife of one of the delegates or the directors, and he said, hello, he said, honey, I want to introduce you to Dr. Lema. She said, oh, yes, we've met before. And he said, no, honey, you've never met him. You see his picture every month because you read the newsletter. And I said, well, I guess you can become a household term just by that. And that's when actually I got people involved in the officers involved in writing their own columns so that they had FaceTime so people could actually see who they were.
Because it used to be just a president's column every month.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But you became first vice president and then president-elect, and during your tenure in the high office, it was a major overhaul.
Well, John Neal was the first one to suggest that I should consider running for ASA president, which is something I really didn't. I wasn't a director. I was the cub reporter for the ASA, and then Jim Cottrell, I remember telling me after I think he became first president-elect, I congratulated him, and he said, "You're running in 2006. No one else is declared." And I said, well, but I'm still doing the newsletter. He said, you've gotten all the accolades you can get in the newsletter. He said, it can only serve to hurt you now by one bad editorial. It was probably one of the more prophetic things that was said to me. And I said, you're absolutely right. You can't get any more notoriety than you already had. And that's when it became time to turn over the reins. And then I became first vice president. I worked very, very hard for convincing people that I was the person for the job. I did everything I needed to do to learn about the politics and everything like that. I was sort of one of these, as I call myself, one of the mutant officers, because I didn't come up through the ranks. I just sort of evolved, by some DNA change there. So and I guess what happened was it was with Gene and Fred Guidry where we realized that ASA had to take a different direction, and we just were very ingrained in an older model that wasn't going to fit the future directions for how ASA and how all societies needed to change. And I remember we were at Marlene's. She was the executive secretary at the time. She passed away, and we were at her wake, and we're in Gene's car, and of course the president and president-elect were in front, and they both turned around and said, it might happen on your watch where we have to sit down and make this decision. And I said, well, if it happens on my watch, I'm up for the task. I mean, I didn't just come here to get the ermine cape and the crown and the scepter and get my picture on the wall. There's a job behind it. And as it turned out, that's when we, talked with Ron Bruns, and Ron realized that we were going in a different direction and required a different skill set, and he agreed to step down to allow us to take this in the direction it is today, which is actually now culminating in the final step that was predicted. We knew it was going to take this long to get to the evolution of a CEO, because the board and the House of Delegates and everyone had to reacclimate to the new concept, the new governance, feel comfortable with it, try it on for size. And we felt confident that they would see that the next logical step was CEO. And I'm sure it's problematic for some people right now, but it is the natural progression, and I think it will make this specialty even stronger.
How did you realize that the organization wasn't as reactive or as structured as it ought to be?
There were a lot of traditional things that were going on. We didn't have an HR department. We kept things lean and mean. People were being promoted through loyalty and not through performance standards. And we constantly seemed to be up against an invisible wall that anytime we wanted to change something, we would hear, that's not the ASA way. And it just, worked for a while, but what would happen, we saw in trying to change the society for the better, and it really started with Roger Litwiller and stepwise change, and then Gene, and then Fred, and then me, and then, obviously Jeff and Roger and Alex and so on. And we realized that we were going to have to change the whole governance in order to get this this ASA way really to destroy it and put in its place something that was more reactive, more responsible, greater member benefit. Because every year we would just be resetting the clock back to where it was with a new president, and they'd just get through the year and then go back again. So, without going into too much detail, there were a lot of things that had to be changed, but clearly it was the infrastructure and the governance that needed to be brought essentially into the 21st century. It was an old model. They hadn't changed it for almost 50 years.
So they were still functioning as they had back when they moved out to Park Ridge.
Well, the president was everything. The president, there was no executive committee that met on a weekly basis via teleconference. We established the office of the presidency, where The vice president through past president all have roles. When I took office as first vice president, it was basically keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, and we'll let you know whenever you need to know something. And then you sort of learned what you had to learn as president-elect. And then basically it was between the executive director and the president, and you know the chain was as strong as its weakest link, which was the president. If you had a weak president, then you'd have to hold your breath for a year until you hopefully got a stronger person in the job. And we said, you can't have what amounts to a $74 million operation being run by someone who's a one-year CEO.
Mark, you're one of those, I think there's 4, maybe 5 people that have been NYSSA president and PGA general chair at the same time.
Oh, yes. Well, there were 3, actually. There was Manny Papper, Alex Gatta, and me.
Yeah,
I don't know if someone else has done it since then, but I don't think they'd be crazy enough to do that. But the PGA was very, very special. It was a wonderful meeting. I don't think most people are shocked when when the NYSSA holds its bragging rights over the ASA to say that the first 2 meetings of the ASA were at the PGA, and that the ASA is incorporated in New York because it stemmed from the associations within New York. So, but nonetheless, it was a venerable, older meeting, and that has a slightly different twist than the ASA. It was the whole concept was to have a panel that went from bench to bedside, and where you could learn about anesthesia for liver disease. From the newest concepts right down to what do I do with someone who, obviously has liver failure. And we actually, because of our location and because of the fact that it was in the same place every year, I think we had a significant advantage over the ASA that had to reinvent itself every year in a different city. And so we were able to build on what we did from year to year, improve, make little tweaks. And I think we established ourselves as a nice international meeting and started to get the international group coming to New York City at Christmas time, not a shabby time to come to New York City. And so it was wonderful in that regard. We did a lot of innovative stuff. There were brilliant scientific program chairs and general chairs over the years, and continue to be outstanding. And
but when you took it over, there were some financial problems.
Oh, that's true. Yes,
I remember
losing
correctly.
$50,000 a year, and in those 7 years, we actually turned a profit of well over $1 million for a state society, which is was pretty good, and allowed them to then purchase the property for a new headquarters, which then they parlayed because they bought low and sold relatively high. So the NYSSA has done very well from a fiscal perspective of just smart investments, et cetera. But I think more important than turning it around fiscally, although most people would say that's really was the fact that we were able to bring the world to the ASA through the PGA, because then the ASA started to say, hey, what do we, chopped liver here? I mean, we should be the biggest program. And what we always thought the ASA and PGA should be was the other meeting for each other. Because not everyone could go to the ASA, because some people had to stay home and do anesthesia, and vice versa. So we would try and say, well, let's not compete with the ASA, because first of all, it is our parent organization, but let's say this is a great alternative, and I think we've had a healthy relationship there.
So, it's interesting you talk about the world, because it's a real lead into the next question. What does a chairman do after he's been ASA president, won the Distinguished Service Award? What do you do next? What's the encore?
Well, I have to say that I sort of backed into that one. A lot of people, who know ASA realize that we needed some restructuring of the Committee on Representation to the WFSA, which really is, I'm still trying to figure out what the committee does, except provide funding for people to go to the WFSA or the World Congress every 4 years. So there came a point when we were looking at the fiscal issues in ASA, and someone said, well, why are we spending all this money on the WFSA? Really, what's the relevance? So a number of us said there's a lot of relevance. You don't want one of your major societies to turn their back on third world anesthesia. So we have to re-educate the members of the ASA as to what the value is, and it starts by getting the right people to go to the World Congress to do the right things, and the only way we could do that was to do it from within. So I was, Jeff was committed, Alex was particularly committed, Alex Hannenberg, and so was Roger. Roger actually is on the wellness or the well-being committee. And so we said we were going to set out to change the attitude toward WFSA from within the ASA. So I stepped in front of someone who I admired very much, and subsequently now is in the role that I had taken. He is now the representative to EXCO. But we needed the...
Who was that, Mark?
That was Baron Metz. And he was on the Publications Committee and did an excellent job. And Baron and I talked, and he understood and was very gracious. And I think we'll see Baron go on to do great things with the WFSA. And he'll have the support of ASA because now they understand the benefits of having ASA members in the WFSA, and I don't think they appreciated it. In fact, I know they didn't appreciate it at the time when we had the meeting in Cape Town. They were wondering why we're spending all that money sending people on a junket.
Mark, is there anything you'd like that we haven't touched upon, or anything else you'd like to add to this interview?
Just one thing. I'm hoping that for those younger members who still have their entire career ahead of them, that there were a lot of things we talked about, and I suppose if they reflected on it, saying, my gosh, you've accomplished a lot in your career, but this all stems from being a resident and getting a fortune cookie when I was on call with one of my attendings, and I still have it to this day posted on my bulletin board, and it said, Confucius say, seek to become, not to acquire. And I think that's what academia is all about. If you seek to continually improve on what you want to be and what you want to do and what you want to leave for the world to say he or she made a small difference in the time that they spent involved in making a society better, you have to actually become something, and it starts from within. So I think that would be a nice way to end this.
Thank you very much for sharing your inspiring story with us. It has been a great pleasure for me to talk about many of the things that I knew about you and some of the things that I didn't, and to kind of reminisce about some of our journey together on this.
Thank you for doing this.
And we would especially like to thank the committee chair, Dr. Bradley Smith, and co-chairs Dr. Marcel Willock and Dr. Frank Scammon for their work and help in editing and producing this video.